Facts are important, so let's talk about them. If you're only going to watch a few seconds, here's the short version. Phil pretends he did something, yet again. Spoilers, he didn't. If you've been taken in by the story of Romeo the Manatee, I ask that you stick around and learn about the reality of the situation behind his relocation. And let me be absolutely clear. I'm glad the manatees were moved.
People have been railing on the seaquarium for literal decades. If you've spent any substantial amount of time advocating for these animals, you'll have heard its horror stories.
Now, I was just going to put all this into the larger pile of things Phil is demonstrably wrong about, but given the recent news frenzy about the man and how he seems uninterested in fact or is intentionally misleading people, I feel it's important to speak up sooner rather than later. So this is going to be in two parts. The background information you need to know about manatees in general, a lead up to the situation of this aquarium, and then the specifics of how Phil Demers doesn't know what he's talking about. First, let's establish the facts. Romeo and Juliet were rescued and brought to this aquarium in the late 1950s. There are different dates in different newspaper articles, but they're all in the late 50s. I couldn't find clear information about what their rescue entailed, so it may have been a capture, but I don't know. So, here's our overall timeline for manatees. The predecessor to the Endangered Species Act, called the Endangered Species Preservation Act, was introduced in 1966. Not long after, manatee protections came into play. The MMPA then showed up in 1972, providing manatees with further protections. And just 1 year later, the Endangered Species Act finally appeared and replaced its earlier versions.
Ultimately, this means Romeo and Juliet predate all legislation regarding manatees. They are referred to as pre-act animals, and the federal government has no say over them.
In 1975, the Miami Aquarium had the distinction of being home to the first captive conceived and born manatee, Lorelei. Romeo and Juliet were her parents. Romeo and Juliet went on to become part of a captive breeding program and produced numerous offspring over the years. And that was a problem. Manatees were reproducing very well in captivity, originally with the idea to breed and release them. The problem being, it didn't seem that any of these captive bred and released animals were actually going on to, live. A later study confirmed the suspected grim numbers. All the while, wild manatees still kept needing rescuing and rehab. Eventually, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was like, stop. And the various facilities holding manatees, who'd more or less come to a similar conclusion, did so. A policy to prevent intentional captive breeding was formally established in 1992. Since then, the primary goal of any facility with manatees was to rehab, then release the animals if possible.
And for good reason. The threats manatees face not only aren't going away, they're getting worse. 2016 was the deadliest year on record for them, until 2021 and 2022 rolled around.
And with their highly contested delisting from endangered status in 2017 and the ongoing unusual mortality event, typically referred to as a UME, that began in early 2021, things still aren't looking good. So keep this in mind as we go forward.
Space to house and rehabilitate manatees currently is limited. Those space constraints likely will require that difficult decisions be made regarding euthanasia. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service must shore up additional facilities or any contingency sites needed to temporarily house rescued manatees until they are able to be released back into the wild. This includes adding capacity at existing facilities. All such measures would minimize the need to euthanize manatees based on space constraints. Which is to say, they were out of space to put manatees. So out of space, that they were ready to begin discussing euthanasia instead of rescue. The UME is ongoing. This is, and has been, making it incredibly difficult to remove manatees from existing facilities holding them, especially one that had been holding the same pair for over half a century.
Now, let's talk about the MRP. The MRP is a partnership comprised of over 24 entities. It was initially founded in 2001. Today, it's basically the body of who's responsible for manatee rescue, rehab, and release, as the U.S. government's Fish and Wildlife Department, who were initially in charge of such things, they've been increasingly less helpful in the being properly funded and helping departments. This aquarium is not only part of the MRP, but has signage about it around their exhibit. This aquarium also used to be one of Florida's handful of acute care facilities. Do I question these choices? Absolutely. Does it change the facts here? No. The MRP was the muscle behind organizing the move of the manatees away from this aquarium, and the machinations behind the move started in 2021. As we know from the USDA reports released from 2021 inspections of this aquarium, there have been problems. One of these problems that this aquarium still hasn't resolved is a lack of staffing. On October 7, 2021, a severely injured manatee named Snuggles was rescued and transported to this aquarium. Not long after, it was brought to the FWC's attention that this aquarium didn't really have enough manpower to see to this manatee's care as often as to the extent that she needed. That manatee died within a month and a half. A brief aside, while it seemed to have been determined via necropsy that the manatee's initial injuries were the cause of its death, I've learned from a reliable source this may not be the case. If I receive further information, I'll be sure to talk about it. This aquarium, recognizing that it was functionally unable to meet its obligations as an acute care facility, requested it be dropped to a holding facility instead.
At the time of these discussions, late 2021, the seaquarium had 14 manatees. Over the course of 2022, the majority of these manatees were either relocated or released. In January 2023, finch and ferret were released, and a month later, hammerhead would be too.
These were the 3 manatees mentioned in the USDA report dated late September 2023. As of December 2023, the aquarium's staffing issues are still present, still being remarked upon by inspectors, and these shortages are very likely why this whole situation developed to begin with.
The seaquarium hadn't been able to secure any new companions for Romeo because their staffing issues had them falling far short of the requirements to be a rehab facility. This was acknowledged in the USDA's inspection and stated by the seaquarium itself.
And moving Clarity out of the facility, which authorities had wanted to do for a while, it would have left Juliet without a companion and it would have just made the problem worse. Remember earlier we mentioned the UME and the limited space? The FWC wanted this aquarium to get its shit together and be able to accept manatees again, because the other facilities were basically full. In order for Zoo Tampa to physically accommodate Romeo and Juliet, 2 manatees had to be relocated to the Georgia Aquarium's manatee rehab space, which was only brought into existence last year in an attempt to help accommodate the casualties from the ongoing UME. You can see how this manatee Tetris quickly scales, requiring a lot of coordination, logistics, permitting, planning. As much as we'd like it to be simple and straightforward to move an animal around, it really isn't. So, there's our background. Check out part 2 of this video for the rest of the details, specifically the many problems with the claims made by Phil Demers and his urgencies group.